Welcome to the National Press Club. My name is John Hughes. I'm an editor at Bloomberg News' First Word. That's our breaking news desk here in Washington. And I am president of the National Press Club. Today our speaker is Deborah Lee James. She is the 23rd Secretary of the Air Force. She's going to talk about ongoing efforts in the Middle East after she's just returned from a trip. She's also going to talk about drones, although she might not use that word that I just used when she refers to these vehicles. But first, I want to introduce our distinguished head table. The table includes both club members and guests of our speaker. From the audience's right, Tony Capaccio, defense reporter for Bloomberg News. Colonel Brooke Leonard, senior military assistant to the Secretary. Patrick Host, correspondent for Defense Daily. Eric Pierce, special assistant to the Secretary. Jerry Zrimsky, bureau chief of the Buffalo News, past president of the National Press Club, and chairman of the Press Club Speakers Committee. Skipping over our speaker for a moment, Jean Teig, the Speakers Committee member who organized today's luncheon. Thank you, Jean. Joe Anselmo, editor-in-chief of Aviation Week magazine. John Hurley, past commander of American Legion Post 20 and an Air Force veteran. I also want to welcome our C-SPAN audiences and our audiences listening on public radio. You can also follow the action on Twitter. Use the hashtag NPCLive. That's NPC Live. Deborah Lee James was sworn in as Secretary of the Air Force nearly 2 years ago, and a newsworthy 2 years it has been. James has made her mark as a tough, no-nonsense Washington insider who has presided over an unprecedented downsizing of Air Force personnel. Meanwhile, she has pushed hard to get her message out on her 3 top priorities. These are stopping further personnel cuts, streamlining the Air Force acquisition system, and making taxpayer dollars count in an Air Force budget of $139 billion. Under her watch, the Air Force has allowed more women to serve in combat roles. In addition, James has pushed hard for full reporting of sexual assaults, focusing on transparency up and down the chain of command. She began her tenure at the helm of the Air Force investigating a widespread missile test cheating scandal. This led to the removal of several senior-ranking Air Force leaders. There has also been progress toward improving the culture in which nuclear missile launch officers perform national security duties. And as if she didn't have enough work already, the Deputy Secretary of Defense recently made James the principal space advisor with expanded responsibilities of all Pentagon space activities. We are grateful with all this that Secretary James made time in her busy schedule to tell us about the state of affairs at the Air Force. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a hearty National Press Club welcome to Secretary of the Air Force, the Honorable Deborah Lee James.
Thank you so much. Thank you, John, Jerry, Jean. Thanks all of you for the invitation for coming here today, and thank you for that very kind introduction as well, John. My own mother couldn't have given me a better build-up than you just gave me. I hope I live up to expectations. Congratulations as well on being elected the 108th president. I know that this club is going to continue to flourish under your leadership. I want to begin by telling all of you it is an absolute honor for me to be here today, and this is actually my second presentation before the National Press Club. If any of you were here about 20 years ago, were you here about 20 years ago, any of you? Come on, some of you were. Yeah, all right. He's changed a lot. I look exactly the same, I want to say. But I actually did have the opportunity to come in the mid-90s when I was Assistant Secretary of Defense for Reserve Affairs. So thanks for having me back. And it is an absolute pleasure to be able to stand here as the 23rd Secretary of the Air Force and talk to you about my favorite subject of all, which is our United States Air Force and your United States Air Force. There is just no question that our Air Force is engaged globally. And when I say globally, I'm talking from Tacoma to Tokyo, from Grand Forks to Greenland. And today, I want to tell you some Air Force stories, but I specifically want to tell you some Air Force stories that are unfolding in the skies above Iraq and Syria, throughout the Horn of Africa, and across European borders. Now, I know a little something about this because you see, precisely 2 weeks ago today, I returned from a whirlwind trip to the Middle East, Africa, and Europe. And during my trip, I met with senior military and civilian leaders from the United States. I had the opportunity to dialogue with quite a few of our partner nations. And most importantly, at every stop, I visited with our airmen. And let me tell you, our airmen are doing a fantastic job, an amazing job each and every day, helping to keep us safe. And I am proud to call myself an airman along their side. Now, in just a few moments, I want to tell you a little bit about where I've been and what I learned from my trip, give you a couple of the key takeaways that I shared with our Secretary of Defense, and then also give you an overall update from my perspective on the conduct of the air campaign in Iraq and Syria. And then I want to finish up with some comments about the #1 asset that our combatant commanders around the world want more of from the United States Air Force. And I'm talking here about the world of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, ISR, as we say, and specifically the world of the remotely piloted aircrafts, which you heard earlier, some people call drones. We do not. They have a lot of men and women who support them. We call them remotely piloted aircrafts. So let's begin at the beginning. The first stop on my trip was the biennial Dubai Air Show, which brings the global aerospace community together and is considered the fastest growing air show in the world. There were about 61 countries represented there, showcasing capabilities in both the defense and civilian sector in aerospace, and I had very valuable bilateral discussions with a number of our allies and partners there, both in government from around the world, governments around the world, and industry. We discussed the importance of interoperability from a military perspective, the importance of joint training in order to be able to operate in a coalition environment, because everything we do nowadays is in a coalition environment. And we discussed specific foreign military sales cases and the need for additional munitions, precision munitions in particular, because you see some of our allies are running low as we collectively prosecute the campaign against daesh and extremism. I then traveled to Qatar and visited the Combined Air Operations Center, what we call the CAOC, where I received an update on the air campaign in Iraq and Syria from General Charles Brown, who is the commander of the United States Air Force's Central Command. And I was really, really impressed with the capability of the coalition and our ongoing efforts to prevent civilian casualties. Enormous care is taken to avoid civilian casualties. I was also struck big time by the complexity of the coalition. Let me repeat, the coalition. There's more than 60 countries involved with this effort in one way, shape, or form, and many of these countries have competing interests and different priorities. Believe me, this trip really brought home to me that old saying of where you stand depends on where you sit. I then traveled to Djibouti and met with the men and women who are serving as part of the Combined Joint Task Force Horn of Africa. And there I also met with senior Djiboutian military officials. I was able to see our remotely piloted aircraft, our RPAs, newly modified with external fuel tanks, which gives them an increased range and coverage, which allows our warfighters and commanders to have a greater reach for ISR flexibility as they require. Djibouti, by the way, is all about location, location, location. Its position on the Horn of Africa allows for critical power projections, surveillance flights above the African continent in places like Libya and Somalia, and allows us to work more closely with partner nations, coalition forces, and some interagency organizations so that we can achieve the very best unified effort possible. I then stopped in Kuwait, where I visited Ali al-Salam Air Base and Camp Arifjan, and then it was on to Iraq. In Iraq, I saw the Combined Joint Operations Center, the CJOC as we call it, which is in Baghdad, and met with General Sean McFarland, who is the commanding general of the Combined Joint Task Force Operation Inherent Resolve. I got to observe in Iraq our airmen flying combat sorties to include a live strike on Daesh combatants controlled by airmen in that CJOC. And I also had the opportunity to meet with the Iraqi Chief of Defense and the Chief of the Air Force, who also spoke of their commitment to this ongoing fight. From Kuwait, it was on to Egypt, where I met with the Egyptian Minister of Defense and the Air Chief of Egypt. And as you can imagine, top of mind for Egyptian officials was terrorism in the Sinai and the terrible, terrible downing of the Russian airliner, which had recently taken place. I then visited Romania and met with their senior military leaders, who were deeply concerned, not so much about Daesh and the air war, but rather about recent Russian activity in the Crimea and in the Black Sea. So remember what I said, where you stand depends on where you sit. And then finally, or not quite finally, Morocco, I met with military leaders and heard about their contribution to the fight in Yemen, as well as their concerns about the Western Sahara. And finally, it was on to Stuttgart, which is the home of AFRICOM, to talk to our own commanders there. And I want to underscore, throughout all of this trip, I had the opportunity to see our airmen of all ranks serving our nation, doing everything from advising foreign militaries to gathering and analyzing intelligence, coordinating the movement of supplies and equipment, and even flying in combat. So my first key takeaway from this trip, and the first point that I made when I returned to Secretary Carter, was that everyone, all of these partner nations with whom I'd met, they want more engagement with the United States. And there's processes to deliver that engagement, and we have got to look for ways to speed it up, to speed up these engagements. All in all, throughout the trip, I had 15 different bilateral meetings, and I heard requests for more training, more exercises. Many expressed interest in buying or upgrading some of their equipment. And my message back to them was always about the total package approach, what I call the total package approach, because it's not just the equipment alone. Obtaining equipment is part one of the package, or obtaining upgrades is part one of the package. But equally important is part two. Part two has to do with training, which includes tactics, techniques, and procedures. And then there's part three, which has to do with maintenance and sustainability. If you have one piece or two pieces, but not all three pieces, you will not have a sustainable program over time. So the bottom line, having talked to all of these individuals, is I believe the United States is the partner of choice for all of them, but I also heard repeatedly about the challenges they feel they face in working with us to get that total package. For instance, the FMS process is lengthy and dissuades some countries from purchasing our equipment. And of course, we have strict technology transfer rules. The complex overall is complex, and it involves not only Air Force, but also other parts of DoD, state, Congress, and industry is involved as well. So I came back recognizing that I obviously don't have power to fix or speed it up in all of these different arenas, but I was going to try to do my best to fix it where I could. And so to that end, I've directed my staff to examine how the Air Force can speed up our part of the process and work with other stakeholders to make sure that U.S. security cooperation efforts are responsive to evolving needs, such as the demand for munitions that I just told you about, based on partner engagements in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. For example, my Deputy Undersecretary for International Affairs, Ms. Heidi Grant, is now working on producing a strategy that will identify capabilities that we would like to see our partners acquire that would allow us to better forecast and prepare for future foreign military sales activity. So this would give us a point of discussion to be able to discuss this with allies in the future. Likewise, we're working to speed up the process by setting pre-approved Air Force technology transfer baselines for major Air Force systems. So if we get this right in the future, instead of waiting for a partner to request a particular capability and then they enter into what can be a very lengthy process to determine whether or not we can actually transfer it, this pre-approved baseline should cut the process down by weeks, if not months, in the future, at least for certain technologies. So this is just the beginning of our efforts. These are some of our initial ideas. We're going to be looking for other ways to speed up at least the Air Force part of this process, and I'll continue to advocate to colleagues in other parts of government as well. Now, building partner capacity is really, really important, especially in light of our ongoing efforts against violent extremist organizations, most notably Daesh, which brings me to my second key takeaway, and that is we need to keep up the fight and we need to up the pressure against Daesh and other violent extremist organizations. Now, we've seen them be savage barbarity across the Middle East, Africa, and Europe. And while I was traveling, Daesh unleashed double suicide bombings in Beirut, killing 43, and it was within 24 hours of that they were at it again, and we saw the horrific attacks in Paris unfold. And oh, by the way, Daesh isn't the only threat we face from violent extremism. My travels covered much of the same territory that serves as a training ground for other violent groups as well, like Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and Al-Qaeda in the lands of the Islamic Maghreb, and Al-Shabaab, and Boko Haram. These are names that many of us have read about. These are all violent extremist organizations. So collectively, we have to keep up the fight, and we have to up the pressure against all of these sorts of organizations. But let me now cut to the chase and get to the part that I know many Americans are wondering about, and that is just how are we doing in this fight against Daesh? Well, I want to direct my comments principally to the air campaign because, of course, that was my focus. So bottom line up front on this, every single senior commander with whom I spoke indicated that our strategy of degrading and ultimately destroying Daesh is proceeding at pace. Everybody indicated that air power is getting its job done. Now, in the very next sentence, everyone also indicated that indigenous ground forces now need to get their part of the job done, and that we also, of course, have to keep the pressure up on the political and diplomatic channels, because in order to get a lasting solution, we ultimately need that diplomacy and political aspect to pay off. Now, let me go over a few of the results of air power to date. For one thing, Daesh no longer has the ability to operate freely in somewhere between 20 to 25% of the populated territory it held 1 year ago in Iraq and Syria. So we've pushed them back to that degree. We've hit their command and control centers, supply lines, destroyed equipment and training sites, disrupted their tactics, techniques, and procedures, not to mention, and you've been reading about this one lately, some of you have been writing about it, we've been attacking their sources of revenue. In addition to enabling local forces to fight Daesh, coalition airstrikes have taken out thousands of fighters, including key leaders that Daesh relies on for command and control, financing, logistics, and propaganda. And moreover, we have upped the ante in what we call deliberate targeting. Deliberate targeting. Now, deliberate targeting means that we detect and identify and develop a target with sufficient time to schedule the action against them in our daily air tasking order, or ATO. The ATO, by the way, is the document that contains all of the planned missions and forces and the targets planned in any given day. So specifically, we are getting higher quality intelligence, we're working more closely with some of the indigenous ground forces, and we're learning more and more about Daesh, how they operate. And all of this has contributed to more of these so-called deliberate targets. Now, here's how the targeting works. First, we study and we collect data. We evaluate existing intelligence and develop a plan to collect additional information. The pre-existing and newly derived intelligence allows us to form an assessment about enemy activity. Second thing we do is we watch. we wait, and we watch some more. We watch with our full motion video platforms, the ISR platforms, and we look for the presence of enemy activity over time and hopefully the absence of civilian activity. Third, we leverage our targeting strategy and decide specifically which weapon is best suited for the target. And using precision-guided munitions, we achieve the right effect on the target while always minimizing, to the best of our ability, the blast effects that might impact surrounding civilian facilities. So the recent strikes against the nearly 400 oil tanker trucks is a great example of deliberate targeting. And it shows that we're going to continue to so-called follow the money and hurt them in their illicit sources of revenue. These are the same types of strikes that have allowed our coalition to shut down oil facilities, such as the Deir ez-Zor facility in Syria, which I'm told accounted for about two-thirds of Daesh's oil revenue. Those particular strikes were executed by F-15s, F-16s, and A-10 aircraft. So all of these statistics and examples persuades me that the air campaign is very much proceeding at pace. We're intensifying our efforts as much as possible, particularly as the indigenous ground forces improve, and particularly as we get more of these deliberate targets. But keep in mind, this fight is not going to be over tomorrow, and there will continue to be complications that will present us challenges along the way. So one clear complication of recent time is the Russian involvement in Syria. Now, what's actually going on here, in my opinion, is what I call a say-do gap. So on the one hand, the Russians say that they entered Syria to attack Daesh. But what they are actually doing is they are focusing most of their strikes not against Daesh, but against other forces on the ground. And what they're really trying to do is prop up the regime of Bashar al-Assad. The Russians also say that they are using precision bombing to avoid civilian casualties. But what they are actually doing, for the most part, is they are dropping dumb bombs, which of course does create significant civilian casualties because they're not as accurate. And they are contributing to making what is already a terrible refugee crisis even worse. So the bit of good news of late to report about Russia and what is going on here is that we do now have a memorandum of understanding to ensure safety of flight between our coalition and Russia. We hold calls, by the way, with the Russian military twice each day, and we've established a common frequency to help deconflict efforts over the area of operations. However, we do not, underscore do not, exchange any operational information such as the type of mission, operating locations, or the duration of our sorties. Now, as for the tragic shootdown, the Turkish shootdown of the Russian aircraft, I too want to join with others who've already said it and make clear that Turkey, like all countries, has the right to self-defense. And Russia did enter their airspace. Claims to the contrary are simply not true. It's also untrue that Russia informed the U.S. of its actions that day through the MOU process. Russia did not. The Turkish jet that tragically shot down the Russian aircraft was executing a national air defense mission, was not part of our daily ATO, like I was telling you about. They were not at that point acting as a member of the coalition as part of our ATO. But with all that said, it was a very, very tragic situation. And we certainly hope and have been urging going forward that both parties will de-escalate the situation and find a diplomatic path forward to resolve the issue. Daesh, after all, is the common enemy, and we have to stay focused. And in the case of Russia, they need to get focused on that threat and the challenge ahead. The other complication, I'll come back and say it again, is helping the indigenous ground forces effectively execute their missions. There's been some progress here as well, and we need to increase the momentum on this as much as possible. One success actually took place while I was traveling. And just by way of background, To the west in Syria is Daesh's so-called capital of Raqqa, and in the east, across the border in Iraq, is another Daesh stronghold, which is Mosul. Now, splitting the two, smack dab in the middle, is the town of Sinjar, which is connected by Highway 47. The thought of the coalition was this: if we could create space by using air power for indigenous forces to attack Daesh in Sinjar, then we might be able to disconnect Daesh's supply lines and retake a key logistical node. And that is exactly what happened. Kurdish and Yazidi forces, backed by our air power, our coalition, helped sever this logistics line and take back the town of Sinjar. And we've also seen some other smaller fighting forces unify against Daesh. Recently in northeast Syria, we had two smaller groups. The Syrian Arabs and Kurds come together to join what we're now calling the Syrian Democratic Forces. Some have called them the Syrian Arab Coalition. But this is the group that we have helped to equip, and they have recaptured some key terrain, most recently pushing Daesh out of the town of Al-Hol and at least 900 square kilometers of surrounding territory. So you see, there is some progress. Finally, as you no doubt saw just yesterday, Secretary Carter announced that we would be accelerating a number of our efforts, particularly he talked some about the special operations world, to include sending what was called some expeditionary targeting forces to counter Daesh and also to help enable these local ground forces to become more effective. Over time, these forces will be conducting raids, hopefully freeing hostages and gathering that all-precious intelligence, which in turn will lead to better deliberative targeting, like I described to you earlier. Though all of this is still being worked out and the details are not final, I can tell you that such a team, illustratively, would certainly have Air Force members front and center and Air Force capabilities front and center. So I'm talking here, typically such teams would have battle airmen as part of the team. There would be mobility forces that would transport them. There would be support from combat search and rescue and from ISR capabilities. So illustratively, you can expect that these sorts of team members would be part of such a thing. Now, there are many, many components to an air campaign like the one I've been describing to you that make it successful, but there's probably none, at least none that I can think of, more important than the value of ISR. And as I mentioned earlier, that just happens to be the number one thing that the combatant commanders want more of from our Air Force. So let me begin to wrap up by concluding with a few comments about that essential strategic capability. Bottom line up front, the airmen who perform this essential mission are doing a phenomenal job. But over the course of my 2 years and talks that I've had directly with the airmen and all sorts of briefings that I have received, certainly have convinced me, and not just me, others in the top Air Force leadership as well, that this is a force under significant stress. Let me explain a little of what I mean. Our operators in the RPA world are flying 900 to 1,100 flight hours per year, and compare that to the manned aircraft, which average 200 to 300 flight hours per year. They are working 13 to 14-hour days, and they work pretty much 6 days per week. The spread of Daesh and other groups means that in addition to our long-standing commitments to allies and partners, we've piled additional requirements on this already strained community. We even had to take some one-off steps in the enterprise, such as literally we removed instructors from our training pipeline to accomplish operational missions. And of course, you know what happens when you take instructors out of the schoolhouse. It means you can't train up the requisite number of new people into the field that you need. So in effect, it becomes a vicious cycle. Now, to address these issues, we've already taken some significant steps to try to alleviate some of these strains. So for example, we're going to be using contractors more in the world of RPA for non-kinetic missions, so not strike missions, but for the surveillance missions. We're going to be using more of our Guard and Reserve in this area. We've boosted incentive pay for some of our RPA pilots. We're leveraging Army ISR platforms in new ways, and we received a temporary reduction in the number of combat air patrols that the Air Force must perform. It used to be 65. We will go down to 60 for some period of time. So these are some of the actions that we've already taken and already announced, but we're not stopping here because there is more work to be done. So I will tell you, stay tuned on this. I'm going to whet your appetite, but stay tuned because we're within a week or so of finalizing and ultimately announcing a series of new initiatives designed to up the ante on this and alleviate some more stress from our RPA enterprise and improve some of the quality of life. For example, today, there are relatively few duty locations for our RPA force to actually serve. So we're looking at expanding basing opportunities for the RPA force. We're also looking at some approaches that are designed to address this grueling schedule that many of our airmen are maintaining. And if we can get that done correctly, that will allow for a little bit more time off as well as some professional development opportunity for this category of airmen over time. You're also, some of you are aware that we have been actively reviewing the role of our officers and our enlisted personnel in the world of the RPA. So we'll have some announcements in that regard as well. We're getting close. Ultimately, our goal in all of this is to direct some positive change from the top down. That's important, but it's insufficient. We also want to do a good job of listening from the bottom up and directing changes that come directly as suggestions from our airmen. If you recall the nuclear enterprise matter that was referenced earlier, we did a very similar approach 2 years ago using what we called the Force Improvement Program, or FIP. FIP basically allowed our nuclear airmen about 2 years ago to have direct access and discussions with senior commanders and offer their suggestions about what needed to change and what needed to happen. And then we took on board many of those suggestions and implemented them. Well, we're basically taking that same approach to the RPA force. But instead of FIP, Force Improvement Program, we're doing the Culture and Process Improvement Program, or CPIP. I mean, we are the Pentagon. We do acronyms very well, you know. So keep your ears and eyes open for some announcements in this world within the next couple of weeks. So I hope you can see we've got a lot going on in our United States Air Force and in our military at large. Many hotspots, many challenges to confront. The reason why the U.S. Air Force is called on by so many in times of need is because we are the greatest Air Force on the planet. But you know what? Remaining the best is going to be a tough, tough challenge, because at this same point where we're the greatest, we're the smallest we've ever been in terms of our numbers since our inception in the year 1947. We're the busiest we've ever been with more frequent deployments, and our airmen are operating what is an aging force of equipment. So going forward, that is why I am going to remain focused on our top 3 priorities. And the top 3 priorities are taking care of people, balancing readiness and modernization so that we get the right mix for today as well as the right mix of investment for tomorrow. And in light of these very tough budget times that we're facing, we have to make every dollar count. We have to be efficient. So these are the 3 priorities. And because, as far as I'm concerned, underpinning all of what we do is our amazing airmen, that is why you will always find that I will put taking care of people as my number 1, always, period, end of story. And on behalf of those more than 660,000 active duty Guard, Reserve, and civilian airmen in our Air Force, I want to thank you very much. Thank all of you for the National Press Club for turning out today, giving me some of your valuable time. I really do appreciate it. Love coming out and telling our Air Force story, and I certainly look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. And for those of you watching on television, we had a lighting accident, so if we look a little dark up here, that's why. We also wanted to mellow the mood a little bit for,
Thank you.
for Q&A. So you talked about deliberate targeting, and I think it's already been reported that the terrorist who was known as Jihadi John was killed in an airstrike from what I would call a drone. And I'm wondering if also the intelligence capabilities that you talked about, the tracking, the observing that led up to that strike, if that also happened through some of the same equipment that you're talking about with deliberate targeting.
So my understanding is that particular incident was also a matter of deliberate targeting, and it was an area that there was an identification. There was a period where we watched. We made sure that there were that the weapon that we selected was the best weapon for the job at hand, and we took great care to avoid the loss of innocent life and the casualties to infrastructures that were not those infrastructures we intended to hit. So yes, that was an example of deliberate targeting.
You said battlefield airmen will be part of the increased effort versus ISIL. Can you be more specific on which kinds of battlefield airmen? Will it include PJs, combat controllers, JTACs, or others? And also, are you considering expanding the existing RPA units in the Guard and the Reserve?
We certainly are looking to do more in our Guard and Reserve in the world of RPAs and expanding both our unit structure and our manning structure there. When it comes to, I'm sorry, what was the other part of the question, the first part?
It was the types of people in the battlefield that you'll be expanding. What types of positions air people will you be tapping for that?
So I was giving you a sort of my best speculation about what these teams illustratively might look like. Obviously, they need to get from point A to point B, and that's the job of the mobility forces. And the battlefield airmen are typically, such as JTACs, could well be a part of it. But the details precisely are not yet worked out. My example was more illustrative to indicate that Air Force is always front and center and part of the team.
Can you give us a sense of the type of aircraft you're deploying on this effort against ISIL, and what proportion would be what I would call drones versus conventional aircraft?
Well, we used a variety of aircraft. In addition to the unmanned aircraft that you're speaking of, we also have used over time and will continue to rotate through appropriately. F-15s, F-16s, various bomber aircraft have been used. So it's really a variety of platforms and a variety of units that are used over time. It gets to a deployment schedule so that we're hopefully not using the exact same people over and over again. So it gets to my point about the busyness of our Air Force because of our small size. In terms of a percentage about how much is this or that aircraft, I'm afraid I just don't have those numbers, but I can tell you that they've all been excellent contributors to the effort. The A-10 is currently over there, and that's another platform that is in active use.
You talked about the effort to minimize collateral damage or civilian deaths in this effort. How satisfied are you in that you've been able to minimize civilian deaths in this campaign? And as you step up this effort now, will the risk of more civilian deaths rise?
I am satisfied that our combined efforts and the way we are approaching this campaign is unprecedented in the history of warfare in terms of the care that we take to do everything possible to try to avoid civilian casualties. Is it 100%? No, because there are from time to time terrible tragedies. But with the thousands of sorties that have been flown, the fact that there have only been a handful of these incidents, I think, is almost a miracle. So I am convinced we're doing a good job. I saw some of it in action myself when I was in the KOC and the CJOC, and enormous care is taken.
How has the strained relationship with Russia, or the relationship with Russia that you talked about, how does that impact the future of the RD-180? Does the Air Force plan to phase it out over time, or will the Air Force continue to use the RD-180 as some members in Congress have called for, particularly Senator Shelby?
So by way of background, in case there are those who aren't tracking this issue on a daily basis, the RD-180 is an engine which is used to power what has been over time our rocket approach to get our satellites into space. The RD-180 is a fairly inexpensive, it's a very efficient engine. It happens to be manufactured in Russia. And over time, I will remind everybody, if we go back 15 years ago, we were trying to make common cause with Russia. It was different times. And so over time, we became very reliant on this engine, which I will repeat what the technical people tell me. It's a very efficient and a fairly inexpensive engine. So it met our needs for many years. With all of that said, 100% of us, both in the executive branch and in Congress, we want to get off of the reliance on this RD-180 engine. We want to have, and we must have, by law and by policy, 2 domestic ways to get us to space. And so what this is going to involve is a new engine manufactured here in the United States must be worked on. And we're working to get that done as quickly as possible. The controversy is how quickly can we get it done? And it turns out this really is rocket science. It's not as easy as it might sound. And if you look over history, it has taken 10 years on average from start to finish when a new development project for a new engine has been done in the past. So we don't think it's going to take 10 years from today to get this done. We think we can beat history, but we're not sure that we can get, we're not at all sure we can get it done by the deadline which has been given to us by Congress. My top job as Secretary of the Air Force, as well as this Principal Defense Space Advisor that you mentioned earlier, is I've got to make sure we can get to space because space is critically important to us. And so we're trying to work this through with the Congress to essentially give us a little bit more leeway, either allow us to use a few more engines for a few more years until we can get this developmental program completed. So we're still trying to work our way through that.
The information that you get through the MOU on Russian planes, do you in turn share that with all of your coalition partners in Syria?
It is shared, I'll say, appropriately with those who are on the air tasking order. So that's one thing, but remember, it's not operational details. I would call it almost administrative in nature. They test out the line to make sure that they're communicating, to make sure that the lines are up and running, the frequencies are up and running, things of this nature. But yes, it is shared appropriately with the coalition.
This questioner says the Air Force has a budget crunch coming within 5 years, starting with the new bomber, the F-35, and the KC-46 tanker. What can you tell us about the budget plan? I know you're actively looking at budgets now for the coming year. What can you tell us about this?
Well, the first thing I would tell you is those are our 3 top programs. The second thing I will tell you, so we're committed to all 3 of them, and we're going to have to figure out a way to make sure that we do fit them in the budget. And you're right, we are all facing a budget crunch going forward. I mentioned we're the smallest Air Force. I also mentioned we're the oldest Air Force in terms of the age of our equipment. You can't keep flying these aircraft forever and ever. I mean, there are aircraft in our inventory that are not quite as old as I am, but, and that's 29, by the way, in case anybody's wondering. But they're aging, and they're aging quickly, just like some of us secretaries of the Air Force. So we have got to modernize. Now, it's a tough budget problem. I want to say we're very grateful in DOD that we appear to have a bipartisan budget agreement to take us through both FY16 and 17, because having stability and knowing what we're planning and executing toward is going to be way, way better than what we have had in the recent past. That's the good news. The thing that worries us is FY17 is about $17 billion for the entirety of DOD less than what we said we needed. So over the next month or 2, we need to, as a team, figure out how we're going to live with $17 billion less in FY17. And of course, whatever we propose for FY17 needs to follow through appropriately for the rest of the 5-year plan. So it's difficult, it's tough, there's no free lunch, but these are important programs and we have to modernize.
The Air Force has said it wants to buy between 80 and 100 bombers, leaving the exact number hanging. Can you tell us whether the service has settled on a number? Will it be 100 or will it be somewhat less?
I believe the number is 100.
And how would you characterize the efforts of the supply chain in responding to the Air Force's efforts to squeeze out costs? Is the supply chain responding adequately, or is there more work on the supply chain to get the costs in line?
Well, of course, I'll speak about the approach that we have been taking, and obviously we in the Air Force are very much part of the Better Buying Power initiatives that have rolled out from OSD. But in addition to those approaches, we've also come up with a series of initiatives that we call bending the cost curve. So this is our complementary approach in addition to Better Buying Power that we're trying to either bring down costs or do things a little bit differently so that we can ultimately buy more for the buck that we will have in the future. So industry is squarely in the middle of this effort that I just called bending the cost curve. We regularly meet with industry on these initiatives. Matter of fact, some of the initiatives, we basically each bring ideas to the table, and then we end up working on things that either industry brings to our attention or that we already know from industry are things that are slowing them down. So we have this additional approach. I would say overall they're responding well. They certainly have responded well to bending the cost curve. But of course, the proof will be in the pudding, and that will be several years down the pike to see whether or not these initiatives really produce real results.
Can you comment on recent reports that the Air Force will delay by a few years the retirement of the A-10 Thunderbolt Warthog? And what about resistance to retirement of the A-10 that exists in Congress?
Well, there certainly has been resistance. That's a correct statement. And this is part of one of the key budget decisions that we'll be making over the next month or two. So I will say everything is on the table, and you can argue these things any which way. So let me go back to basics. We proposed that the A-10 be retired over the course of 5 years, not because we don't like the A-10, but rather because we had to choose to retire something, we had to choose to cut something, and given the age of the aircraft, the single-purpose nature and so on, it seemed to be the best approach. So that's one way to argue it. On the other hand, we're using it, rotating it into the Middle Eastern theater. It's doing a good job for us. So that's perhaps a reason to keep it a bit longer. So you can argue this one way or the other, but I do want to come back to a comment I made a moment ago. There's no free lunch, except maybe at the National Press Club, for me. So if not that, then what do we reduce? Because we can't, particularly with $17 billion less in FY17, we're not going to be able to do it all. So these are the kind of the end game final decisions that are going to have to be made in the next month or two.
At what point does the move to control costs harm readiness, and are we getting anywhere close to that point?
Yes, we are getting close to that point. I think it already has happened to a degree. Readiness for us, by the way, is a factor of, I'll say, two key things. Number one is how we invest our money, and I think we've done a pretty good job of investing our money. So this is, do we put enough money against flying hours and training of all sorts, and are we upgrading our ranges and making sure that we have infrastructure so that our pilots and other crew members can practice against high-end threats. So in terms of our investments, I think we're investing in the right places. The other part of readiness, though, is you've got to actually free your people up so that they can go and engage in this training, and they've got to do it on a regular basis because these skills atrophy. There's where we're not doing as well. Why aren't we freeing people up? Because they're busy. They're busy doing some of these missions that I just told you about. So those are the two key parts of readiness. I'm optimistic that we're investing correctly, but I don't foresee necessarily next year that we're going to be able to free our teams up to put them through enough of this training in order that we get our readiness levels up.
Have any new rules of engagement been promulgated for Air Force operations over the disputed South China Sea maritime territory?
I'm not aware of anything new. What I am aware of is that we, of course, reserve the right, like all sovereign nations, to exercise freedom of navigation, and that goes for on the sea and in the air. But that, of course, is a longstanding proposition. There's nothing new about that. So that's my knowledge of the South China Sea question.
How severe is the cybersecurity threat to the Air Force, and what is the Air Force doing about this?
I think cybersecurity is a major consideration for all of us these days. It certainly is a huge consideration for our military, and for those of you in industry, I have to believe it is for you as well. So what we're doing about it is we are trying to systematically go through and identify any weaknesses that we might find, both in our IT systems. That's one piece of the approach, but then we also have to systematically go through and look at our weapon systems and see if there are vulnerabilities in this area as well. And then when we find them, we need to hop on it, and as quickly as we can, we need to address it, and we need to fix it in some approach, so in some way. So it's a major concern. It's something we talk about all the time. Once again, I think we can probably do a bit more going forward in the area of investment. And I also think we need to double down on our efforts to look at using increasingly cyber in ways which would be a substitute for kinetic operations.
This questioner says 1 month ago at the UN, there was a vote for disarmament in space. The vote was 122 for and 4 against. The U.S. was one of the 4 against. Why is the U.S. against disarmament in space?
Well, I'm not familiar with that vote, but what I will tell you about space and the proposition of space is this. Number one, we don't have weapons in space in the United States. Number two, we're very focused on not creating debris in space. So to back up for just a minute, if you go back 20, 30 years, there were relatively few countries and few companies, for that matter, who even could get themselves to space. But flash forward to the present day, and there are many more countries and many more companies, plus there is debris in space, there is space junk. So you've got thousands of these pieces of material whirling around at 40 or 50,000 miles an hour, and even a small piece of debris can do some serious damage to $1 billion satellite. So debris is bad, and we want to make sure that we minimize that at all costs. Now, what has been very worrisome in recent years is that some of our some other countries around the world, notably China and Russia, are investing and they're testing in different types of capabilities which could shoot satellites out of orbit and do other things to our capabilities and the capabilities of allies in space, which is worrisome. And so what we have said is we need to focus more attention on space. We need to invest more in space, the resiliency of space. And we need to, at all times, get this point across, particularly to some of these other countries that are investing and testing in these ways, that debris is bad. Debris hurts all of us.
At the beginning of your tenure, you committed to making sure there is better treatment for victims of sexual assault at places like the Lackland Training Center, the Air Force Academy, and overseas remote deployment areas. How are these programs going? Are you happy with the results of this program encouraging women to report assaults?
I think we're making progress on sexual assault, so I'm satisfied that we're heading in the right direction, but I'm certainly not satisfied that the work is done. So we have to, once again, we have to keep up the focus and keep up the pressure to make sure that we are taking care of victims better. And again, I think we're making progress to make sure that more people feel comfortable reporting, to make sure that there is follow-up as appropriate in the justice system. Now, I said I believe we're making progress. Why do I think that? Well, there's kind of 2 key points I'll give you. Number one, I look at the overall statistics that we have on the number of reports of sexual assault, the anonymous reporting that we have in terms of incidents of sexual assault year over year, and I will tell you reports are up and the actual incidents are down. both of which are not good enough, but they're in the right direction, because you want people to be comfortable reporting, but hopefully the number of actual cases year after year go down. So those two are good statistics. So I watch the overall statistics, that's one thing. The other thing I do is everywhere I go, I try to sit down privately and personally with the SARC on the base. So that's the Sexual Assault Response Coordinator. Sometimes there's a Special Victims Council there, sometimes there's victim advocates. But my point is, I meet privately with the frontline defenders on the war on sexual assault, I'll say, and they report to me overwhelmingly that they think we're making progress on all fronts but one. And here comes the hardest of all, I think, and where I'm definitely not satisfied, and that is the issue of retaliation. So retaliation, by the way, can be, if you report sexual assault, the boss takes some action against you, which is or feels like retaliation. So I'll call that official retaliation. And then the other form is just when your peers in the unit kind of find out what's happened or what allegedly happened, and then they take sides, and maybe they treat you differently, or maybe people who were your friends now shun you. I'll call that unofficial retaliation. Our biggest problem is on that unofficial part. It's with the peers in the unit and people who rush to judgment and take sides. So I'm not satisfied we've cracked that nut yet. We have to keep on that one, and indeed, that's going to be a major focus of our training going forward.
Who is going to replace Dr. LaPlante as acquisition czar?
Well, Rich Lombardi is now in the acting capacity, so that's Dr. LaPlante's deputy, who has fleeted up to the acting role. And beyond that, we'll have to work our way through it and see who the permanent person will be.
Is that your call, or does the White House make that call?
Well, ultimately, all of these positions are presidential appointments.
Okay. We are almost out of time, but before I ask the last question, I have some housekeeping. The National Press Club is the world's leading professional organization for journalists, and we fight for a free press worldwide. To learn more about the club, go to our website, press.org. To donate to our nonprofit Journalism Institute, visit press.org/institute. I'd like to remind you about some upcoming events. This Friday, December 4th, Prince Ali Al Hussein, FIFA presidential hopeful and son of King Hussein of Jordan, will address a National Press Club luncheon. Also on Friday, starting at 7 a.m., the Press Club will publicly read articles by Washington Post reporter Jason Rezaian for 24 consecutive hours. The club is doing this to draw attention to the 500 days Rezaian has been unjustly detained in an Iranian prison. And on Tuesday, December 8th, David Skorton, the new secretary of the Smithsonian Institution, will address a press club luncheon. I'd now like to present our guest with the most valuable and sought-after National Press Club mug.
All right. Very cool. Thank you.
Very close to Air Force colors.
Yes.
We'll just say that's Air Force blue today.
Excellent.
Final question. You were recently spotted at the Air Force Navy football game in Annapolis, and you were wearing an Air Force jersey with the number 23 on it, and I assume the 23rd because you are the 23rd
Right.
secretary, so that's your number on the jersey. So we'd like your assessment right from the top. How's the Air Force football team looking? What's the future looking for this team? Is there hope? Give the assessment from the very top level on that football team.
Okay, my top level assessment is we are going all the way, and don't believe any statistics or any talk to the contrary. So that is my favorite team, and you're right, my jersey is 23. I'm lucky 23 because I'm the 23rd Secretary of the Air Force. So all the way, we've had the Commander-in-Chief trophy now for 2 years, and even if the Navy takes it away from us, we may have misplaced it. I mean, I'm not even sure where it is. So.
How about a round of applause for our speakers?
Thank you very much. Yeah, that was great. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Great question and answer session.
Thank you.
I would also like to thank the National Press Club staff, including its Journalism Institute and Broadcast Center, for organizing today's event. If you would like a copy of today's program or to learn more about the National Press Club, visit our website, press.org. Thank you. We are adjourned.